G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 Fantasy video. Today we're going through my first team selection video of the 2024 F1 Fantasy season. So if you're new around here, you're yet to subscribe to the channel, be sure to do so and drop a like on the video in the meantime, because there's going to be plenty more content much like this throughout the 2024 F1 season. So I'm going to take a look in this video at a couple of the different team builds I'm weighing up ahead of the Bahrain Grand Prix, and towards the end of the video I'll take a look at a third team, one that up until about 48 hours ago had not really come onto my radar, but there has been a little bit of chatter about this particular build. So I'm not going to neglect it entirely, but I did think it was worth a discussion because it does look like there's a couple of really strong assets in there that are probably worth you thinking about if they haven't already crossed your mind. So we'll jump straight into this team. I'll walk you through every single driver and constructor from the top. We'll start with Max Verstappen. His record speaks for himself. In 2023 alone, he had 19 wins, 12 pole positions, 9 fastest laps, and a podium in all but one race. So he's going to be the first name on my team lineup. He essentially picks himself for the DRS boost as a lock there. And I think even at $30 million is pretty fairly priced given the kind of fantasy production you're going to get from him week in, week out. There's been some talk lately around no Verstappen lineups, and if you are in a league or a team that cannot have Max Verstappen, I think that's a separate discussion altogether. But I think for the purpose of this video, we're going to assume that that doesn't come into play. I just can't look past someone who was the top fantasy scorer in 15 of the 22 races we had last season. Now, I think there are going to be instances where he is outscored by Lando Norris, Sergio Perez, Charles Leclerc, for instance. But I don't think it's worth the risk trying to chase those other drivers in certain races to outscore him when you're going to get proven fantasy production from Max just about every single race week. His reliability is second to none. Has not DNF'd in a race since I think Australia 2022. That season he had 2 DNFs in the first 3 races of the year. Hasn't had one since then. So a pretty impeccable record. And if you haven't followed F1 prior to Australia 2022, you've yet to see Max finish a race in the pits or on the side of the road. So I think his form and reliability is unparalleled, unmatched by any other asset in the game. I think Red Bull Racing Constructor is the other probably asset compared to the next build I'll show you shortly that I'm tossing up at the moment. I think one of the reasons for starting with Red Bull is that if they look hot out of the blocks and Perez is looking the goods, you've already got them locked in. It becomes much harder to get to Red Bull if you're starting with a Ferrari and say a Charles Leclerc in the slot in place of Daniel Ricciardo, and then having to chase the points that have been scored by Red Bull. They essentially look, a second or two faster than most cars per lap. They were running a very low engine mode setup, if I think that's the wording that I saw written out earlier. And if you're trying to get on the Red Bull train, if it's already left the station and you're a race behind, having to make those 2 changes out of the blocks to get to Red Bull Constructor is probably not something I want to be doing in the second race weekend of the season. There might be other fires in your team you might need to put out as well. Pierre Gasly and Alpine, as much as I was optimistic about them prior to preseason testing, are probably a question mark in my team at the moment. So if you're trying to rectify other issues in your team on top of getting to Red Bull, that's a -10, potential -10 hit right off the bat, something I really want to avoid early on in the season. But I think coming back to Red Bull, my decision on getting them into my team solely rests on Sergio Perez and his form. If he is inside the top 5 through the free practice sessions on Thursday and Friday, he essentially guarantees Red Bull in my team. If he is Sergio Perez that doesn't finish the race, that DNFs, that doesn't get out of Q1, that just looks terrible in practice, then I'm probably going to get cold feet on Red Bull. But I think to ignore them entirely is perhaps a little negligent in fantasy terms. No one is essential, no asset, no driver or constructor, but Red Bull was the highest scoring constructor last season. They averaged 84 points per race, a phenomenal average considering the next best were Ferrari and Mercedes down in the 40s. Red Bull aside, I've also got Ricciardo, Tsunoda, and RB. All bases covered in the RB house. I really like the value for money there. I think they've certainly got Q3 potential as well, despite the fact that the top 5 teams do look pretty solid. But I think Ricciardo and Tsunoda both showed towards the end of last season they are very reliable fantasy assets. And I also really think that they are maybe a little bit underpriced, depending on what that RB ultimately turns out to be. There's talk that they could be knocking on the door of the top 5, but they also could be front of the midfield. I guess the gulf between the top 4, top 5 teams in the midfield is quite substantial. So I'm really fascinated to see whether or not Ricciardo and Tsunoda can, edge the odd top 5 finish early on in the season, or if it's going to be something where they end up just being a step ahead of the back markers in the midfield, but not yet able to make it into or break through into the top 5 in terms of constructors. Albon at 7 million, a great budget enabler, highest owned asset, 63% in all teams. I think he's probably underpriced a little bit as well, maybe by about $1 million or so. I thought he'd be probably closer to Tsunoda. But his Williams, we saw he outperformed it all of last season. I think that's going to continue into 2024 as well. Now, Alpine, I've got question marks about them given they're serving up essentially a tractor for Bahrain. Gasly and Ocon both very pessimistic through the first few days of testing. And if you did want to pivot to something alternate to what we've got here in terms of Tsunoda and Gasly, you could go for say, someone like Lance Stroll and then bring in, say, a Valtteri Bottas. Now, for Aston Martin, I think it's pretty close looking at Stroll versus Tsunoda. The Aston Martin is a higher performing car, I think. Probably not by that much. But Stroll's inconsistency is somewhat a good thing in fantasy because he's going to qualify a little bit lower. It typically has a pretty poor qualifying history, Lance Stroll. That puts him in the position for positions gained and overtakes if that Aston Martin is, expected to do quite well. And we know we saw that a lot early in last season as well. Lance Stroll arrived in Bahrain this time around without broken wrists, so maybe that's a good omen for him as well. But I think Tsunoda's explosiveness, if we're comparing him to Stroll, he had an exceptional few races to close out 2023. If we look at his fantasy performance, he had 11, 30, 20, 22, 14, and 21. I think that was averaging close to about 20 points per race, if my math is correct. So over that 6-race span. So, I think Stroll and Tsunoda, you're probably splitting hairs over. As for Valtteri Bottas versus Gasly, the Sauber I just wasn't really excited about in preseason testing. I know Alpine's going to be slow as well, but Bottas was an absolute non-factor on our fantasy radars all of last year. I expect that's going to be very much the same this go around. Some people are even saying they could finish lower than Haas in the constructors. So if I'm tossing up between Gasly and Bottas, I think Gasly wins that one for me. So this is kind of where my first team, or at least my first preference for team is at the moment. But I think a lot could change once we get into the free practice sessions. Now, for my second team, very similar skeleton to the first team. The difference is, and I alluded to this earlier, having, say, Ferrari and Charles Leclerc in place of Ricciardo and the Red Bull constructor. Now, I think Ferrari is going to be Red Bull's closest rival through the first couple of races of the season. Sainz and Leclerc looked exceptional in preseason testing. They set leading times in day 2 and 3 of testing. They recorded the second highest lap count among all teams with 416. And as it stands right now, I think Sainz and Leclerc are going to be in the top 5 in Bahrain based on the pace we were seeing from them through those first 3 days of testing. Now, I also think McLaren and Mercedes are going to ramp up their performance. I don't know if it's enough to match Ferrari in the first race. I'm happily proven wrong for that. But McLaren and Mercedes intentionally kept their cards close to their chest in testing. They may well reveal a few extra surprises to us once we get to free practice, but I'm going off what I do know versus what I don't as it stands right now. Ferrari also second in qualifying pace. We'll quickly go over to the F1 website. Really good sign. They're really not that far off Red Bull in quali sim. Yes, they maybe take a step back in race simulation pace, but I think the difference between them and Mercedes is going to be negligible, to be completely honest. So I'm really optimistic that Ferrari have a car to contend with Red Bull from the outset. Another thing to think about, though, is along with that qualifying simulation pace, Leclerc, we know how good he is as a qualifier. He could easily take pole in Bahrain. They had 7 poles as a team through 2023. This second place only to Red Bull, only because Max single-handedly willed that team to the Constructors and the Drivers' Championship last year. But I think an alternate build to this skeleton is obviously tossing up between, again, Tsunoda and Gasly. I think you could, if you like Ricciardo more, you could bring him in over Yuki Tsunoda. I think the difference is pretty small between those two. As I pointed out, Tsunoda had a really good finish to the year last year. Ricciardo's got that experience, got those race wins, and we know how hungry he's going to be for that Red Bull seat. So I think it's going to be pretty close between those two. But if you feel strongly about Ricciardo, then Gasly, I think, is an easy make way. For someone like Joe or Valtteri Bottas, again, I think I'm probably leaning towards Tsunoda and Gasly again for the reasons mentioned before. But I think you can make a case for both, particularly if Sauber look a little bit better through the free practice sessions on Thursday and Friday. So for the third team I teased earlier in the video, this is a very different team to what I've had on the screen through the first couple of team builds. Now, I think Max going to be a mainstay through all of these teams I'm looking at for the reasons I mentioned at the start of the video. But I'm going to, instead of going with one premium and one mid-price constructor, going for 2 heavy hitters in Mercedes and Ferrari and build out the rest of the team from there. I think, again, a lot of the names I've already listed, Ricciardo, Tsunoda, Albon, Bottas, Joe you could always put in as well if you wanted to. I don't think there's really much difference between the two Sauber drivers. I think this team is a really interesting team. Now, for the fantasy managers that have been around for a number of years, having a powerhouse constructor is essential to scoring you a lot of fantasy points week in, week out. You need to have at least one to give yourself any chance of mixing it with the top teams every single week. And I really like this for Ferrari and Mercedes. As you can tell, it's probably getting a little late here. I really like this Mercedes and Ferrari combination. Going back to f1fantasytools.com, these guys averaged 48 and 45 points respectively. That comes out at around 93, 94 points per race. You look at Red Bull and AlphaTauri, that's closer to 98. You're splitting hairs on the difference between these two combinations of constructors. So it is pretty close. And in fantasy terms, a couple of points really doesn't mean that much at all. I think the encouraging thing for this build is that Mercedes alone, which is quite bizarre what I'm about to say, had 0 fast pit stop points all of last year. Zero. Red Bull, McLaren, Ferrari, all good for banking fast pit stop points. Mercedes had 0. So if you're looking at their fantasy data alone, 48 points without pit stop points, which I think could be good for 5 to 10 points extra per race, that really pushes them up as a viable fantasy asset to own if they can get their act together there. I think also encouraging is the fact that Mercedes are a step ahead from where they were 12 months ago. I think they're going to be very competitive from the outset, as opposed to taking them 4 to 8 races last year to find their stride and secure a more consistent run of podiums. In fact, as I pointed out on the race simulation data, they had the second fastest race simulation pace among all teams, ahead of Ferrari. So, second to only Red Bull. So I think these two guys are probably my picks for the constructors. I'm not so sure McLaren has the same amount of value. They're 3 million more. And sure, like I said before, maybe they are kind of keeping their cards close to their chest. They don't want to reveal everything at the moment, given they had a really strong finish to 2023. But I think going off what we do know and the optimism that Lewis and George have both said, the baseline for this car is much better compared to where it was a year or two ago. They're able to make the upgrades more effectively and address any deficiencies in performance more effectively. So I think it's a really good sign that they've got that kind of flexibility and viability and reliability, because they have been a pretty consistently reliable team over the last few seasons, fantasy-wise anyway. But again, I'm going to be waiting for practice to see what Lewis and George can do in that car, because there are some people that are saying Mercedes are going to be right up the front and rivaling Red Bull and Ferrari. There are other people that are saying they just haven't got the pace and are going to be well down the pecking order fighting it out with Aston Martin for P5. So you could swing both ways for Mercedes, but if they can get their act together, I really think they're going to be a pretty decent pick at 20.1 million. But I'm going to leave it there, guys. I'll be back with my final thoughts video later in the week. And in that video, I also address my final team thoughts as well. So be sure to drop in for that one too. But hopefully this gives you a bit of an idea of where my head's at. Hopefully it gives you some ideas for your own team builds if you haven't already considered these options. And we're only, 4 days or so away from the first fantasy deadline of the year. 4 days, 11 hours, and 57 minutes at the time of recording. So very exciting for another big F1 fantasy season. There's going to be a lot of content on the way. So be sure to subscribe if you haven't done so already. But I'll leave it there for now, guys. I appreciate you dropping by, and I'll catch you all very soon.